What's up everyone, Vu of NVU Films again, and I'm back with another idiotic video for you to watch. And today's idiotic video will probably force you to buy additional lenses you may or may not need off of my affiliate links below. And that's the entire point of this video, but let's get to it. So a couple months ago, I did a video with regards to the best lenses to get for your Sony a7S III for video. Mainly the lenses I focused on were autofocus lenses, lenses that you could also use for photography, not quote unquote cinema glass, etc., but just general use glass on the E-mount system. And the lens I recommended, and I still recommend to get, is a Sigma 2470 DG-DN. DN stands for These Nuts lens, and it is by far the most versatile lens for most use cases for the E-mount system or any camera system. A 24-70 is probably the most versatile for just general shooting. You have the 24mm on the wide end, 70mm on the telephoto end, and usually it's made with very high quality glass. There's 3 different ones for the Sony a7S III and every other E-mount camera. It is the Tamron 28-75 f2.8, the 24-70 Sony G Master, and this Sigma 24-70 DG-DN. DN stands for These Nuts lens. Yes, there's also the f4 variants or the 24-105 f4, but I'm really into the f2.8 for this fast aperture. Why do I recommend this lens over the Tamron? Simply better build quality and the fact that you get 24mm. Also, it focuses a lot better in low light in my tests. Secondly, there's also the GM version, which is an older lens. This lens performs just as good or better than the GM lens in many use cases, in many tests I've seen and I've done, and is also less than half the cost of the G Master lens, which is why I always recommend the Sigma DG-DN. DN stands for These Nuts lens from Sigma for your Sony E-mount system. So with a lens like the 2470, you get a lot of versatility. In today's video, I want to talk about why you may also want to get some prime lenses for your E-mount collection. With that being said, to get the prime lenses that even match this range of lens in terms of focal range, you're looking at a 24 f1.4 G Master. This is the 24mm that I would recommend for the Sony E-mount system. You also have the 20mm f1.8, which is also a fantastic lens that I don't have. So you can go even wider, but for filming, in terms of what I like to do, I prefer 24mm. Then the next lens is a 35mm f1.8 prime. And then the next lens here, mounted on my Sony a7S III, is the 55mm f1.8 Zeiss. Again, there's other options for you, such as a 45mm f1.8 Samyang, which is a pretty good lens as well for very cheap, it's only $300. And of course, there's also the 60mm Sigma DG-DN. There's a lot of different prime lenses you could get that fits into this range. These are the ones that I have, and these are the ones I'm going to discuss. And this is a Sigma 85mm DG-DN. DN stands for These Nuts lens. Obviously, there's also the Sony 85, which is about $500-600, and the Sony G Master at like $1,600-1,700-1,800. I like this one because it's f1.4 and it's priced right in between, and also it has good size, great optics, great autofocus, all of that jazz. Now, why would you want to go for a prime lens versus a zoom lens, even though the zoom would do most everything for you? And of course, the Sony a7S III has great low light performance. So why do you need to worry about getting something like, I don't know, an f1.4, f1.8, when f2.8 does a fantastic job? And the most simple, the most basic reasoning I would have, it's hard for me to illustrate without showing like footage and stuff like that. But there are certain qualities about lenses, such as prime lenses, and the fact that you could open up to f1.8, f1.4, that gives the image a distinct look over what an f2.8 can do. In my opinion, most f2.8, most 2470s, f2.8, as well as 16-35 f2.8 lenses that I've ever had the opportunity to use and test, have a very technical feature to it. The newer ones are generally very sharp, technically sound, and just have a very, it's hard for me to explain, but it's a little bit less artsy than a prime lens. And I think a lot of the reason why is because prime lenses obviously could open up with wider aperture, so you get a lot more background blur, and with that you get a little bit more imperfections when you're opening up wide. A little bit softer image, looks a little more filmic, for lack of a better word, cinematic, pleasing. I don't know, but there's a distinct look you get with a prime lens. Quick example that I could show very easily is this 55mm f1.8 Zeiss. It's a very old lens. It's been a while for a while. Autofocus is still great, like most E-mount autofocus lenses, pretty much because the Sony system just has amazing autofocus in general. So pretty much any lens you put on it is going to perform very well. It has like a distinct flare that comes across the screen that I really only get with this lens. And it kind of creates this very dreamy, this very nice look when it has backlighting. And it's a very distinct look I cannot get with the Sigma 2470 DGDN. I know exactly what I'm going to get with this lens. I know the look I'm going to get, and I really like it. Sigma 85 f1.4. Obviously, 85mm range has like this very nice portrait, has this very nice compression look. It isolates the subject, it squares everything off, and it just looks very nice. It has a very distinct look. It's something that you cannot get when you're zoomed in at 70mm f2.8. You're not going to get the same depth, the same compression, the same enlarged background, the same isolation as you would get as an 85 f1.4. And that's what you pay money for. That's what you go through the hassle of switching out lenses for, is to get these distinct looks. 35mm f1.8 is another example. Like usually when you're down to like a 35mm on f2.8, you start losing background blur, meaning you get this nice wider image, but then you lose that depth of field. The 35mm lets you have that subject isolation for that environmental portrait look while still maintaining that nice subject isolation, that nice shallow depth of field. Same thing goes with the 24mm f1.4. The 24mm f1.4 looks 1,000 times better than the 24mm on this Sigma 24-70 f2.8 or any 24mm 270 f2.8 lens, because this thing does not have much distortion, if at all, versus this lens at 24mm. The wideness, you're going to get some distortion. You have the lack of separation, even more so than the 35. Now you have like a more deep depth field instead of shallow. With the 24, you just get like, you could isolate your subject as well as have a very nice blurred background while maintaining a very wide field of view. And the reason why it's completely fine for me to shoot 24mm on this, because most of the time I'm just shooting the venue of a wedding, the environment. So I need deep depth field. But this is a very specialized look if that is what you're going for. I use this a lot for like YouTube stuff, or if I just want like a more dynamic shot, isolate the subject and get more of the background, but also not keeping the background blurry. So the subject is what you want to key into and don't get distracted by the background. Like I own all of these lenses. I have them and I use them for specific use cases. When I'm doing run and gun shooting like weddings, a lot of times I just gravitate to the Sigma 2470 DGDN because you just have to be able to get multiple different shots at the same time. I could get a wide shot, go in 2 seconds later, get a tighter medium shot, and get a telephoto shot all within 10 seconds. Versus, if I'm stuck with the 55, all I'm going to get is that one focal length, and all I'm going to get is that one look. It helps if you're a solo shooter to shoot 2470 DGDN if you're shooting all by yourself, just because you could get multiple different looks, one lens, without having to switch out. However, if you're in more controlled situations, studio shooting, if you're filming a documentary, if you're filming a movie, a special project, I would recommend you shoot with primes, just because you can really dial in a look. Like I told you before, the 55 millimeter with the flaring, the 85 millimeter with that nice depth of field, that nice subject isolation, that nice compression. That does not mean you can't get a certain special look with a DG, with a 24-70 more technical lens. Simply by putting a Tiffin Black Pro Mist or some other type of diffusion filter onto your lens helps it get more distinct looks, helps it get more, something a little more, that little nice little artsy, dreamy touch to an otherwise very technically sound, sharp lens. You know, a lot of people complain about mirrorless cameras like the Sony a7S III that it looks a little bit too digital, a little bit too sharp. And a lot of it's because the lens lacks some character. That's why cinema glass, when you test like a cinema lens on like a Red or Ari, Alexa, those glass, the cinema glass have like certain characteristics to it, which a lot of times these photography based lenses lack because they're geared more towards like these technical, they have to battle distortion, they have to battle chromatic aberration. Just a simple example would be anamorphic lenses have that really distinct look, people go for versus just a standard lens. With that being said, I still recommend you have a 24-70, specifically this DGDN. DN stands for D's Nuts lens in your kit for your Sony a7S III for just overall versatility with your shooting needs. And in the top of my head, I'm going to go through a deep dive of prime lenses that I recommend you get for your E-mount if you're wanting a more distinct look. If you want a 20 to 24 millimeter range, either the 24 GM lens or the 20 millimeter f1.8 lens. This is going to run you around $1,400. The 20 millimeter f1.8 is about $800 to $900. So that is your option for that 20 to 24 millimeter range. At the 35 millimeter range, you have some more choices. You have the 35 millimeter f1.2, which is a massive lens from Sigma. You have this 35 millimeter f1.8 from Sony, which is the one I recommend because a nice size, it's f1.8, and it's a very nice lens optically. You also have the 35 millimeter Zeiss f1.4, which I used to own, which is kind of weird. It misfocused sometimes. There's just some really odd things about that particular lens that I was not fully satisfied with. But I'm sure that if you want something like just crazy, you just get the 35 millimeter f1.2 from Sigma. And of course, there are like other budget options out there, like the Samyangs of the world, or the new 35 f2 from Sigma, DGDN. DN stands for D's Nuts lens. That is also an option. You go to the 50. There's a 50 millimeter Sony that I've always told people to avoid, but if you're on a budget, I guess $200 is fine. But if you're in like that $200 to $300 budget range, I recommend getting the Samyang 45 millimeter f1.8 lens. It is a very nice looking lens and it's very inexpensive. If you want the best overall quality around the 45, 55 millimeter range, the 55 millimeter Zeiss is a good option for size. But the best one is a 50 millimeter f1.4 Zeiss, which is around $1,400. If you really want that micro contrast, if you really want that f1.4 bokeh action, then that's the one you'd go for. I used to own that, but I just went for the smaller size of the 55 instead because it performs very well and I like these certain characteristics that this lens produces. Then you have 85, which I already mentioned. You have a bunch of 85s. You have the GM, which is the most expensive. You have the 85 Sony, which is $600, which is one of the cheapest. You also have Viltrox. You also have Samyang 85s. I never got to try that, but I've heard great reviews about those lenses. But I recommend the DN. DN stands for D's Nuts 85 because it's a great performer, great build quality, and I like the characteristics of this lens overall as well. That being said, I hope this video was somewhat helpful. I didn't know where I was going with it. I just had this thought in my mind. I just wanted to talk about why you'd want to get a prime lens versus just sticking with the 24-70 DGDN all the time. That does not, I've seen a lot of great work produced with this lens. I myself has created some work that I was very satisfied with this lens. But at times, I want this little bit of extra look, this little bit of extra feeling and control out of the footage I'm getting. And that's where prime lenses come in, and that's where you're spending a lot of your extra money. I mean, if you look at it this way, it's like A7 III versus A7S III. You got the A7S III because you want these little extra looks. You want that extra sharpness from 4K 60 instead of 1080 60. You want 10-bit colors instead of 8-bit colors. You want dynamic range, all those little things. It's the same concept when when it comes down to the lenses you buy. You get a lot of versatility with the DG-DN 2470, but at the same time at f2.8, you do lose out some of those nice characteristics that an f1.8, f1.4 prime lens gets you, aside from just more light for low light situations, aside from just more bokeh. They also provide very distinctive looks for your film and photos if you're into that kind of thing. With that being said, that is it for today, guys. I hope this video was helpful. Until next time, lighten up.